Good morning to our fourth episode of Eat NATO for Breakfast show. I am Nora Garcia, talking to you from Madrid. I'm part of the International People's Assembly and the coordination of the Peace Summit. Thank you all for being here with us. This breakfast today is a tough one. The situation in Ukraine has blown up. Russia has invaded Ukraine. It seems we need to deal with a whole new reality. Probably we have read a lot of articles, tweets, and news. But today we want to build a moment of reflection, calm exchange, and a more in-depth analysis connecting this escalate of tensions of the past few months on the international landscape with NATO. We have seen people going to the streets, demonstrating for peace. There are a lot of calls for immediate halt of any aggressions in Ukraine. In many cities worldwide, people are out on the streets today, like our friends in Belgium. Many of us working towards peace are being attacked in the black and white idea, in a simplistic way, either Russia or US. We say we are on the side of peace. So we urge you to sign our declaration, the Peace Summit No to NATO Madrid 2022 declaration on our website. So please join us in this very moment. Francie, good morning. Please tell us more on why we are talking today about Ukraine.
Hey, good morning all. Thank you for joining us. It seems a difficult moment, the way you said, Nora. It seems like it's not a moment for words, but for actions. But I think when the urgent begins to override the important, and when we mix up cause and effect, then we really get lost somewhere. So I think I agree with you very much that it's time for a moment of reflection. In our last breakfast, we were talking about the new Cold War against China with Ajit and Fiona, and they helped us sort of expose the most used cliches from the West to justify the Cold War against China, and gave us arguments to understand why it's a central issue on the NATO's agenda. Much of what we learned then can be shown, or you can see in the dealings with Russia in the last couple of years. But now it seems like we're in a totally new situation, and this Cold War at least has turned hot already. I want to welcome Jörg Kronauer. He's a German journalist specializing in NATO issues. And before we even begin to look at the more difficult, complex relationships and the negotiations and the dependencies and the economics that underlie all these current tensions, can you help us, for people who have just gotten up this morning, with an update on what is actually going on right now on the ground? Like, what is the situation? What can we see right now? What's the status?
Thank you. Right now, we can see that the Russian military offensive is going on. Russia continues to attack. They have taken several airfields, which makes their attacks even more possible. They have taken the first one of the big cities, Melitopol in southern Ukraine. They they are just now attacking Kiev. There's street fighting in Kiev. There are explosions in Kiev, but they have not yet taken Kiev. It's not yet clear how many people have died in the war. The Ukrainian government says around 200 civilian people have been killed. More than 1,000 have been wounded. The United Nations say that approximately 100,000 are fleeing the country. So the situation is really quite bad. And as I said, fighting is going on. We will see how it proceeds today. Ukrainian President Zelensky, just a couple of minutes ago, called the people to fight, to continue fighting. It's not only the Ukrainian military which is fighting. Ukrainian civilians have been delivered weapons to take part in the fight against the Russian army. This is one side of the story. At the same time, President Zelensky has offered talks to Russia. Yesterday, he said he would be prepared to talk to Russia to settle a deal. He would even be prepared to talk about a neutral status for Ukraine, something Russia always has demanded. In Moscow, the Russian government has been talking about that. Obviously, it has not agreed yet to talks. Putin yesterday has called for a military coup in Ukraine. He called Ukrainian soldiers to stand up against their own government. That has not happened. Anyway, he has called for a coup. Then, if you look at outside Ukraine itself, President Zelensky always has demanded more support, even weapon support from European countries. That has not happened yet. The EU instead has brought sanctions into effect, heavy financial and economic sanctions. So, for example, there will be no European capital for Russian banks anymore. There will be no economic deals for Russian state enterprises anymore. The European Union has brought into effect sanctions against President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov. That is more or less symbolic, but anyway, it's an important symbol. The United States have imposed sanctions. The UK and even Japan have imposed sanctions on Russia. So international pressure is growing. Although one can see that in a way the West is kind of not making progress into other parts of the world in rallying countries against Russia. There was the UN Security Council voting on a resolution condemning the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And interestingly, only 11 of the 15 countries supported it, although the United States and even the European countries exerted huge pressure on all other countries to support it. The countries which didn't support it was, of course, Russia, but then China, who abstained to vote, and interestingly, even India and the United Arab Emirates abstained from the vote. So they did not condemn Russia, which is quite interesting because both of them, the United Arab Emirates and even India, are collaborating closely with the West and are even supported closely by the West. So yeah, there is no united international front against Russia. One last point, NATO has activated their defense plans and started deploying the NATO response force and the very high readiness task force to the east. They won't enter into war against Russia. That's obvious. They made that really very clear, but they just put troops to the east as a signal that Russia will meet strong resistance if they continue the war beyond Ukraine, what they don't want. But anyway, NATO is mobilizing as well.
Thank you very much for portraying us like what's going on now. We feel that we've been hearing about this issue on Ukraine for several months, but right now everything is getting very, very, very fast. But we want to talk about one concrete thing, because in the last day, we heard a lot about how the situation got to this point. NATO's policy of encirclement, NATO as the armed force of the US to keep the world hegemony, the European Union following a suicidal path in their own continent, acting as the bulldogs of NATO. But one big issue has been rising because for sure people are also concerned for solutions. We have been hearing that one possibility to de-escalate tensions would be a commitment that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. We want in this Eat NATO for Breakfast for sure think together how all this is connected, why this is that important. Is it still also in this moment that you are describing a key thing to solve or to go towards a solution of this situation? And you know, what does the conflict in Ukraine have to do with NATO's strategy?
Yeah, I think quite a lot. In fact, it's 2 points which really closely have to do with NATO. One is, I think, to really understand it, we have to go back a couple of years. We have to go back, in fact, to the beginning of the 1990s, which sounds strange, but I think it will become clear why. In 1990, when the communist states in Eastern Europe collapsed, some leading Western politicians promised the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand east. That was very important by then. Why? The reason was that in the Cold War, there was a balance of power in Europe. And it was obvious at the beginning of the 1990s, as soon as NATO would start to expand east, that balance of power would be destroyed and things could become very dangerous, that would lead to instability. So this is why it was important that NATO promised not to expand east. But the thing is, this promise quite quickly got broken. And as you can see here on the map, to the left, you see NATO in 1990, and to the right, you see NATO just now. The red countries are NATO countries, and the light red countries are countries close to NATO, not member states, but close to NATO. The thing is, NATO has got really close to Russia, even bordering Russia in the Baltic countries. And at the same time, NATO has started to deploy troops east to the eastern and southeastern member countries. And that means that this is obviously a threat to Russia. So, I mean, people are talking about an encirclement of Russia, and there's a map on which you can see exactly this encirclement of Russia. Here, these points, they are NATO bases just around Russia. So that's the strategic situation. It's US bases, to be precise, not only NATO bases, but mostly US bases. But they are encircling Russia, and that is a really dangerous situation for Russia. All right. The thing is, Ukraine has a special meaning for Russia. One reason is that Ukraine has a very long border to Russia, which means in case of an attack from Ukrainian soil to Russia, it is difficult to defend. And a second point is, if you look back into history, Russia has been attacked several times from Europe. The most infamous 2 times, the First and the Second World War, when Russia was attacked by Germany. And the thing is, the attacks failed in the last instance because there was a huge territory between the Western countries, the European countries, and Russia, or at least the Russian capital, Moscow. So in the last century, the German military did not succeed to make it really to conquer the Russian capital because of the huge space between their own country and the Russian capital. So this huge distance in strategic debates is called strategic depth. That is how experts call it. And now imagine if Ukraine joins NATO, this strategic depth immediately will be lost. For Russia, it would be really hard, maybe even impossible, to defend itself against a potential NATO attack as soon as Ukraine joins NATO. This might sound a bit abstract to you, but remember, just a week ago, there were Russian troops gathering at the Ukrainian border, and everyone was telling, with good reason, as we know today, that is a huge danger for Ukraine. So the other way around, imagine how dangerous NATO troops at the Ukrainian Russian border would look to Russia. So this is why Russia has always been strongly opposed to Ukraine joining NATO. Now, many people say every country is free to choose its alliances, so why shouldn't Ukraine join NATO? If you look closer at it, it's true. It's just like in personal life, everyone can do freely just what they wish. But in personal life, there are limits to this freedom to do what you want. No one has the freedom to infringe on the rights of others. In the world of states, there are international agreements which have a similar meaning. For example, the Charter of European Security signed by the OSCE in November 1999, and that means all NATO countries signed it, even Russia and Ukraine signed it, and it says very clearly that on the one hand, each and every participating state is free to choose its treaties of alliance, but at the same time, it says that quote, "Each participating state has an equal right to security. Each participating state will respect the rights of all others in these regards. They will not strengthen their own security at the expense of the security of other states," unquote. So that is an argument against Ukraine joining NATO, and it's part of the Charter for European Security, signed even by NATO countries.
Thank you for this exploration, this really detailed exploration, explaining sort of the NATO connection with the with Russia and which role the Ukraine plays in it. When we talk about these types of geopolitical aspects of a conflict or a problem, then it always, at least to me, sounds a little bit like a very big game of Risk, where people are where sort of armies and negotiations happen. But often it is about, like, it sounds like the Ukraine is a space that exists empty to either protect or not protect, make vulnerable Russia, or the other way around. But then, of course, Ukraine is a country not only huge and with many, many people, that comes with its own history, with its own contradictions, where people have agendas. You mentioned earlier Zelensky already, like the government, the Ukrainian government also has an agenda. It also plays a role in this conflict. It is not just something to be, I don't know, in the end fought over and ignored. Can you help us a little bit understand what is actually happening within the country? Where did, for example, in alliance, I mean, the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, the entire Soviet Union broke apart, but where are the conflict lines there? What does the what is the Ukraine, for us to know and understand better?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a really important question, because Ukraine shows how fateful it can be if NATO or NATO countries start to meddle into another country, breaking its sovereignty in a way. You can observe that in Ukraine. If you look back 10 years ago, NATO was very unpopular in Ukraine. That is quite interesting. And at one point, NATO wanted to do a military exercises together with the Ukrainian armed forces in Crimea. There were huge protests in Crimea, and NATO was not able to do that military exercise in Crimea. People just protested, and it shows, by the way, that protests can be successful. People rise and go onto the streets and really protest. They can drive NATO out. The thing in Ukraine is you have to go back quite long into history, because Ukraine is a country which formerly belonged in its western parts to Austria-Hungary, in its eastern part to Russia, and it has a very diverse society even today. In the western parts of the country, Ukrainian is the mainly spoken language. It's the native language of most of them. In the east and in the south of the country, most people use Russian as their native language. So that's a difference. And you could say it doesn't matter. There are many countries in the world where many different languages are being spoken. But the thing is, in Ukraine, it's connected to a history, to a specific history, and it's connected to different types of nationalism. In Western Ukraine, Ukrainian nationalism is very strong, and it is very strongly anti-Russian. At the same time, it's closely connected to fascism, which is really sad, but it's a historic fact. In the 1930s and in the 1940s, many Ukrainian nationalists sided with Nazi Germany and even fought against the Soviet Union in the Second World War. And while doing that, they, of course, fought people in today's Eastern Ukraine, Russian-speaking people, who fought against the Nazis. So Ukraine is a country where people in the East were fighting in the Second World War against people in the west of the country. So the split between the two parts is even strong, or has always been strong until today. That Ukraine was able to manage that fact quite well until in 2013 the protests on the Maidan broke. The protests on the Maidan, they were supported mainly by Western Ukrainian nationalists, and they wanted to get closer to NATO and to the EU. And for that reason, they were supported strongly by NATO countries. It is important to mention that at the Maidan, among the protesters, about 1/3 of them were Bandera admirers, Bandera being the main figure of the Ukrainian fascists of Western Ukraine. This led to the fact that Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine were very critical towards Maidan protests, and the Maidan protests were very decisive in Ukraine. Now imagine NATO countries supporting the Maidan protests, which were very divisive in Ukraine. That is a grave fact. And it turned out after the Maidan protests were successful and the government in Kiev was toppled and replaced by the so-called Maidan government, people in southern and eastern Ukraine started to protest and even to try and split their country, their regions from Ukraine. And Crimea succeeded in splitting from Ukraine. It became part of Russia. Eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, they also tried to split from Russia, but they did not really succeed. No one recognized them until quite recently, just a couple of days ago, when Russia finally recognized them as own nation states. That's the story, and it shows how NATO meddling, supporting the Maidan protests, can contribute to splitting a country, even splitting a country into different parts.
Thank you, Jörg, for this, for giving us a little bit of the Ukrainian perspective on all of this, and how difficult, how a Cold War, and how no country is actually safe and really protected in its sovereignty. That sovereignty is a very, very fragile state of being for most countries, especially when they're in specific regions, or when they have, I don't know, specific resources. Let's think of other NATO meddling that is, more directly bloody, such as Iraq or Afghanistan, etc., etc. So that's. Thank you for that. I have another question that brings us a little bit outside of the actual conflict region. You write for German foreign policy, which means that I assume you have specific insights into what's going on in Germany, or at least this is one field of your interest. We've seen in this situation right now. We have heard a lot about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We have heard a lot about what is the European Union doing. Now Germany is a big player within the European Union and determines quite a bit which direction the European Union takes in its allyship with or against Russia, closer to the US, farther away from the US. Other leaders in Europe have been talking directly to Russia, such as Macron. What do we expect here in Europe? What is happening in the more European region? What is to be expected for example, for the people here? Now the Nord Stream pipeline is just not happening. This is something that has been announced. Whether this will remain the fact, we'll see. But as of now, what does that mean to people here? And also, can you explore a little bit what the likely alliances will be, in what influence that will have on the alliances or on the hold of Europe together in its projects? Thank you.
Yeah, that is quite a broad topic. One important aspect is that the sanctions which the EU imposed on Russia, they will have a huge impact on the European economy as a whole. So it is quite obvious that they will result in economic problems, mainly regarding energy. The reason is Russia is one of the world's biggest oil and gas producers, and the EU imports large amounts of oil and gas from Russia, especially gas. And the gas is coming via pipelines, which means, on the other hand, it is not easy to replace. That means if the gas imports from Russia are disrupted, no gas will be there anymore quite quickly. And as it seems at the moment, it will not be possible to replace Russian gas quickly by imports from other countries. So that's a huge problem. Already now it drives oil and gas prices in new heights. So it's obvious that energy prices will remain very high for at least as long as the conflict is going on, and not only the war, but even the sanctions and the conflict as a whole. So that's a big problem, and high energy prices mean that everyone in Europe will have to pay more just for heating, for depends how you cook, but for everything you need energy for, you will pay more than before, and that will be the case for quite a while. So that's one immediate impact on Europe. Another impact is that there are different ideas inside Europe on how to proceed policy-wise towards Russia because of the strong energy dependency on Russia. There are some countries which are opposed to stronger sanctions, like, for example, Germany or Italy. On the other hand, there are countries who want to have even heavier sanctions, which are, for example, Poland and the Baltic countries. So this is something which kind of splits the European Union into different factions, at least. It's not really clear whether the split between the different factions will get worse or whether it will calm down. We will see. That depends on how the war will proceed. But it's definitely something we will have to pay attention to and analyze carefully, just to get a good assumption on how the situation in Europe will develop.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very important. And this split on the European Union also shows that we are not acting towards our own interests in our own continent, right? So I think what we see also in Europe is this contradiction on how to proceed as a NATO member, but also as a European Union member, and this is going to have an impact on all us, to all of us, right? I don't know, Francisca, if you have any other question. I know that for this exchange, we wanted more time because we think that is important. So I don't know if you have any other question to ask to Jörg.
Well, I think that we need to talk a little bit about what do we do next, like sort of where we started out this conversation. What is the, what will the peace movements, what can the peace movements do? What should we be doing? How should we be organizing? Where is the line that we draw in the sand? What do we, it leaves so many of us, it leaves many of us here in a difficult, complex situation, struggling with understanding and struggling with taking the right steps forward. And I think this is something that we need to discuss here for sure. I don't know if Jörg has some advice, but I think that this is one of the things that we need to address.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I mean, one thing is just to go out onto the streets and protest against the war. That is always correct and makes sense, I think. But on the other hand, if we want to be successful, we have to think about the future, because the war, which is happening just now, we can't prevent it anymore. Maybe we can support stopping it, but we failed to prevent it. And we should think about preventing the coming wars. This is what I think. And If we look back at how that war, if we look back at the conflict underlying that war, then we can see that it has to do something with NATO expanding east, with NATO meddling into the affairs of Ukraine, with NATO just doing many really stupid things, not out of the interests of the people, but out of the interests of the ruling class. And I think we have to make clear that this war is nothing, or even NATO expansion is nothing which has to do anything with our interests. So I think we should make definitely clear that we won't let NATO do anything like that in the future. So I would think we should protest against the war, definitely, but also we should protest against NATO's activities, and with the aim to prevent future conflicts. That is something we can succeed at, but we have to try that, and we have to try now. I think, not wait until the next conflict gets worse and worse and close to another war.
Yeah, I think that this is something that we need to stand very clear. NATO is not a defensive organization. You just asked us to show some maps that shows the strategy, and this situation is awful. We have a war in Europe, but we need to think about, as you said, the future, and that's something that is also a struggle that we have to do organized, but also in our own countries. Like, we are part, like, I don't know, our countries, for instance, the ones that we are here in, are part of NATO, and that's something that we need to fight. We need to assume that military architectures, military alliances produces wars and not defend peace, and we need to really think towards a future that needs some really huge issues to tackle. We are in the middle of the pandemic. We have to deal with the climate crisis, and we need to really focus on what's ahead. We need to also structure this process as Peace Summit to say that we have this moment in Madrid in June, and we need to really think together on NATO and the role of NATO in everything. I don't know. We don't want to end this episode talking also about this issue of peace. Because for this, we are not meaning only the absence of war. We mean that we need to really think on a genuine alternative to our world. We need to take action. The peace movement needs a common strategy to change things. That's why we also want to share this important event organized today by Code Pink and CND on Ukraine this evening at 6 p.m. CET time. So please tune in.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you for this call to action and for this event, and also for the reminder that the main enemy is in our own countries. Liebknecht famously said that 100 years ago, over 100 years ago at this point. So we have to hold accountable our own governments for direct and indirect warfare. As Jörg points out, this actually leads to direct warfare inevitably. For weapon deliveries, for sanctions, for overt and covert interference, for nuclear armaments, and in fact, just prioritizing military alliances over alliances and agreements for cooperation and common goods for the people. So I think this is, again, the call to join for the Peace Summit in Madrid, where we will try to confront NATO and exactly this agenda and make the people heard. But until then, we need to protest this war immediately, and then think of, and quite frankly, while we are at it, maybe we should also consider protesting all other wars that are going on currently that have been completely off the table, as if they didn't happen. As people pointed out, like, there is a war going on in Yemen. Afghanistan is barely 3 months ago. People are suffering tremendously in Afghanistan as a direct consequence of this war that's been going on for years. So while we go out there and protest this war that is seemingly on our doorsteps, we should be protesting all wars going on in all countries. I want to thank Jörg for joining us today. Thank you, Nora, for guiding us through this. Next year, we'll hear from our Italian friends.
Next week, not next year.
Oh.
Next week.
Thank you for pointing out. I'm trying to think long term. Next week, we will speak with Giuliano Granato, who is the national spokesperson for Potere al Popolo. They will be talking on how NATO affects the internal political processes in member countries. So on topics like sovereignty, democracy, and social and environmental equity. I think that's going to be very interesting. It dives even deeper into the relations of NATO and its member countries. And they will do so in Italian. So please tell your Italian friends and brush up on your Italian. Stay safe and keep fighting NATO and war. And thank you very much for joining. See you next week.
Thank you. Also, People's Dispatch.
People's Dispatch. Thank you.
Bye-bye.